All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the Prevention Measures Law Project, a tool for assessing legal preparedness for emergencies, brought to you by the Network for Public Health Law. My name is Daniel Wacker. I'm the Program Development Associate at the network, and I'll be your host today. We strongly encourage audience participation, so feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A feature and save the chat for responses to questions that'll be posed by the panelists later in the webinar. So to begin, to introduce, I'll hand it off to Denise Chrysler, a senior advisor for the Mid-States Region Office, who will introduce her fellow panelist.
Thanks, Daniel. It's great to be with everybody. As we know, just from being public health lawyers and from COVID and all of our other experience, when it comes to public health powers, these are mostly exercised at the state, territorial, tribal, and local government levels. So it's really essential that we know our laws that govern us and are able to implement those laws. So Stacy and I will be providing an overview of the newly drafted Prevention Measures Law Assessment Tool. This is a tool that jurisdictions may use for their legal preparedness, and it helps them assess the sufficiency of their legal authority to implement communicable disease prevention measures. These can include both non-pharmaceutical measures and measures to increase access to pharmaceuticals. Next slide, please. Oh, back slide, please. Thank you, Daniel. I'm Denise Chrysler. I am a senior advisor at the network's Mid-States Region Office. Until recently, I served as director of that office. I retired in February 2023. I'm now part-time and so happy that I can continue working in public health law. Today, for the last decade, in fact, I've served as a volunteer on my county board of health. Before joining the network, I spent over 27 years providing legal services to Michigan State Health Department. There, I served in lots of capacities, and throughout my career, I've provided legal assistance, consulting, and training related to communicable disease, immunization, environmental public health research, data reporting and sharing, privacy, health information exchange, and emergency legal preparedness and response. And from there, I'll ask Stacy, my co-presenter, to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Stacy Kirshner. I am a consultant with the Network for Public Health Law on this project. I'm also the Deputy Director and a Senior Academic Professional at Georgia State University College of Law at the Center for Law, Health, and Society. At the Center for Law, Health, and Society, I manage our new and ongoing health law education, research, and community outreach efforts. I teach public health law to law and graduate students and conduct research primarily on communicable disease prevention. I am also the program planner for the law section of APHA. Been here at Georgia State for about 11 years, and before that I was an ORISE fellow with the Centers for Disease Control's Public Health Law program. And we're excited to talk about this updated tool that I had the privilege of working on while I was a fellow a decade ago, so we're coming back around.
Now, next slide, please, Daniel. Just our agenda. First, I'll be providing an introduction to the tool. I'll talk about its partners and history, hopefully quickly. Stacy, we want to have most of the time to cover the tool, the tool itself. It'll include a template to identify and assess your jurisdiction's law and a tabletop exercise to practice implementation of your authority and identify any gaps. This is an update of a tool that was first developed 16 years ago. And Stacy will cover what's new and improved to reflect our subsequent experience with all sorts of communicable disease threats, including COVID-19, Ebola, monkeypox, measles, Zika, drug tuberculosis, and I'm sure there are others I've forgotten from the last 10 years. The Prevention Measure Law Assessment Tool is a draft update to the social distancing law assessment tool. And hopefully we have people on our call today who were actually involved with the original tools and using them for their own legal preparedness. This tool was originally developed by the Centers for Disease Control and ASTO, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials. And last year, the CDC awarded funds to ASTO to update the tool, and they brought in the Network for Public Health Law for this update. Our recently retired national director, Donna Levin, she was working on the tool until her retirement. She was part of the original round in 2007, implementing the social distancing law project and using the tool, including a tabletop exercise. I did the same thing for the state of Michigan. I was Michigan's lead when I was with our state health department. I think that Stacy mentioned, if she didn't, she was involved with the implementation of the second iteration of the tool in 2009 and 2010, when she was an ORISE fellow with the CDC. So first a poll, just so we know who's on the call today. Daniel? Which of the following best represents your employment? Please check federal government, state government, local government, tribal government, territorial government, research academic, or if it's an other, just pop it in the chat. Daniel, I don't know how long to provide and how to get our response. Okay. Lots of state and local government. I am so happy to see 3 people from tribal government, and we have added issues in the tool to address specific issues that involve tribal government and tribal authority that we will hope will make it more valuable. Great. And then next question, Daniel. Which of the following best represents your role? Attorney, public health professional, emergency management professional, researcher or academic, or other? Again, pop it in the chat. Okay, we have a lot of public health professionals, good size attorneys, few emergency preparedness professionals. Great. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about past participation in the social distancing law project, and specifically my experience in Michigan. I think I mentioned the tool was first developed and launched in 2007. For the first round, we had 17 participating jurisdictions: Alaska, California, Connecticut, Washington State, Washington, D.C., Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Puerto Rico, Texas, Virginia, and Washington State. And then for round 2 in 2009 to 2010 were 9 states: Alabama, Missouri, Nebraska, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Utah. As Stacy will be talking about our changes, we hope to include local governments and tribal governments in those who are able to use the tool. So when I was with Michigan State Health Department, the health department still serves as the lead for pandemic response, and ensures that the health system has capacity to provide for care for all hazards. Planning occurred on all levels, continues to occur on all levels, including public health, law enforcement, environmental health, agriculture, health systems, and many other sectors. But there are a couple of things missing. First, the public health attorneys we're missing. I know that is hard to believe today, but in 2006, we didn't get much attention. But we in Michigan, and I know youth throughout the nation, advocated for the importance of public health law and the role public health law must play in emergency preparedness. And so we were included and participated in all of the exercises, learn the communication systems, and then using the social distancing law project, we were able to assess and have a comprehensive completion of an analysis of our tools and the gaps, and to implement the tabletop exercise in order to test. We had done work before, but our work was all piecemeal. And so using the social distancing law project, it helped us bring all of these pieces together and then to be able to share the tool and use it to educate, train our counterparts that were providing all sorts of other public health emergency support. While the while the tool was tremendously helpful, I think you can join me in realizing a lot has happened since 2007. And since then, of course, I listed a number of diseases we've experienced, and COVID certainly has taught us all many lessons and has helped shine a light on what we needed to do to update the tool. I know in 2007, I had no idea. We focused on, and the tool focused on, what was your legal authority? We didn't focus a lot on whether people would understand and accept your legal authority. And I know I certainly had never expected in 2007 to expect and be prepared for pushback. I also didn't spend a lot of time in 2007, and the tool didn't spend as much time on how do you enforce your authority. And I had just always assumed that law enforcement would be our ally and would be there lockstep with us in doing what needed to be done during a public health emergency. So so those are the kind of things and other things that Stacy will talk about that the tool was updated to address. Daniel, could you do another poll for me, please? And then I'll turn it over to Stacy. So based on this map, do you live in a jurisdiction that participated in rounds 1 or 2 of the social distancing project? Just yes or no. I think, Daniel, can we get the results? 66% yes, great. And now let's go on to Stacy. And that'll be the next slide.
Great, thank you, Denise. Thank you, Daniel. So the tool was originally called the Social Distancing Law Project, or SDLP for short. And the original tool examined measures such as quarantine and isolation, school dismissal, business closures, and cancellation of mass gatherings. And these are all measures that we know have been important to some degree at various times throughout the COVID response. But we also know that there are many other measures to prevent disease control that have been really important as well. And so we really knew the tool needed to be updated. We also recognize the importance of having both non-pharmaceutical and pharmaceutical measures that are facilitating the distribution of those pharmaceutical measures. So we've really expanded this tool to encompass a broader range. And one of the biggest things that we changed is the name. During COVID, we realized that that these measures are intended to keep people physically distanced in order to not spread disease. But of course, they're not keeping us socially apart. And there's so many different ways that we can be socially together while being physically apart. So we've updated the tool to a new name, the Prevention Measures Law Project, or PMLP, in order to capture that element that is sort of new to this era. So what makes this new tool new and improved aside from the name? So originally, the Social Distancing Law Project, and in fact, much of our emergency preparedness efforts in the early 2000s were directed to influenza specifically. Based on the experience of the past decade, and as Denise has said, we know we need to be prepared for a variety of different possible communicable disease outbreaks, and that's everything from Ebola to COVID to monkeypox, but also to things that we see more commonly, unfortunately, measles, and then also tuberculosis. These are all threats that we've faced over the past 10 years since H1N1 and the original social distancing law projects were carried out. Our updated tool allows jurisdictions to examine the sufficiency of your legal authority for various different diseases, and allows you also to take a look at unknown threats and how it would play out in your jurisdiction if an unknown threat were to come out. So while the Social Distancing Law Project was directed at state public health officials and attorneys, and to some degree also territorial health officials, this updated version is to be used by state, local, territorial, and tribal, as Denise said, health department officials and public health attorneys, as well as public health practitioners and partners who are in departments and agencies such as education, transportation, law enforcement, emergency management, all those who are charged with understanding, implementing, and enforcing laws authorizing social distancing measures in order to prevent and control communicable diseases. To identify additional areas where the tool needed revision or enhancement, we convened a work group about a year ago in the spring of 2020. If anyone's on the call who's part of that work group, thank you so much for your participation, for your help over the past year. Some of the work group members were leads or participants in their state's social distancing law project in rounds 1 or 2, and others were successors to those positions who may not have participated at the time, but their state did. We asked the work group a series of questions about the tool, the pros and cons, and how the information gathered during the social distancing law project was useful for their jurisdiction over the past decade, and particularly during COVID, and what improvements they felt should be made. We saw several different themes emerging from that conversation, and they're there on your screen. The first one is legal authority. Some of the jurisdictions who participated found the tool really valuable because it served as the basis for developing guidance and template orders, some of which were used then during COVID-19. However, they said that better understanding is needed of authority at each level of government, as well as across agencies, in order to have a more cohesive response. So questions in this version are added to address the interaction between jurisdictions, including possible preemption, if the federal government may be preempting the states, or if there might be state preemption of local efforts. And also in cooperation with neighboring jurisdictions, perhaps collaboration to ensure that the communication is more clear and more smooth with jurisdictions that have close boundaries and where people are going back and forth a lot. Also implementation. Some jurisdictions felt it would be helpful to learn what different approaches other jurisdictions might have for the same problem in order to potentially improve response. They also felt that more attention needed to be paid to compliance and enforcement, as Denise mentioned. There was also recognition that if enforcement is being handled by a third party, not public health, they need to have input, be on board as much as possible, and even be compensated for their time if needed. There was also a consensus that the bandwidth of healthcare entities and law enforcement agencies in particular needs to be considered as the planning is moving forward. So this is also added. Equity. Equity was a huge issue that arose during our conversation, and a very serious theme we wanted to make sure to address. Many jurisdictions felt that little legal preparedness efforts had really considered the disparate impact on communities of color or low-income communities during prior planning efforts. And equitable enforcement. They really thought that we needed to look at ensuring that measures were applied consistently, implemented consistently, and with the intent to reduce potential burden on already burdened communities. So we've added in questions that have to do with health equity, and we're hoping that that will be more useful going forward. Communication. We really got a lot of information from our work group members that building relationships with the community based on mutual respect and trust is so important, and that first communication shouldn't be during an emergency. And so understanding best practices in communicating complex legal language for lay understanding is also really critical to getting out the message efficiently and effectively when that emergency does come up. And finally, the last of the themes that arose was continuity. Work group members emphasized the importance of putting systems in place to maintain the information and practice response regularly. As I mentioned, some of our work group members were actually successors to the people who had participated in their planning. So passing information along to successors in the new position, in their new positions, is also really important to making sure that there is a efficient and effective response. All right, so what do we have included in the tool now? Daniel, if you could switch the slide. Great. So the new updated Prevention Measures Law Project, PMLP, allows jurisdictions to assess their legal authority to respond with various different prevention measures. First, there's a report providing background information and describing in detail how a jurisdiction may implement the tool. And then we've split it so that there's also a user guide, which is much more comprehensive than the previous one and includes a legal assessment with a template questionnaire to complete for your jurisdiction. We included that in the original social distancing law project, but this is an expanded questionnaire, and I'll show you some of those questions in just a minute. And then also instructions for carrying out the legal consultation meeting and a tabletop exercise to test the sufficiency of those laws. And again, I'll talk about a little bit about the differences in the updates in that tabletop in the next few slides. And the resulting product from these two components is a report where you can record your after action steps for your jurisdiction. Okay, if you could flip the slide again, Daniel, thanks. Okay, so the first component of the tool is an analysis of the prevention measures and preparation of a report detailing the sufficiency of the laws both prior to or in absence of a declared public health emergency and after the emergency is declared. The jurisdiction's legal counsel is the most likely person to be completing this tool, or at least like overseeing and reviewing its completion. The purpose of this legal assessment is to compile the relevant legal authorities supporting implementation and enforcement of disease control measures and identifying any gaps, uncertainties, or ambiguities in those authorities. The assessment includes a section for each of the disease control measures we'll show you on the next slide, and the questions are designed to be asked twice. The first is for the legal authorities that exist when there isn't an emergency order in place, or there isn't yet an emergency order in place. And the next time you go through it, it's to respond when there is an emergency order in place. So first, it's the measures the jurisdiction can generally take under their everyday legal authorities. And next, you're looking at it when perhaps the governor or a public health emergency has been ordered specifically. And these orders tend to expand the options of what's available to prevent or control a disease during an emergency. The questions then continue by analyzing whether these legal authorities are sufficient to implement and enforce the measure. The jurisdiction will want to consider how best to address the potential gaps that are identified before needing to use those measures during an outbreak. Okay, Daniel. Great. So the updated version of the tool contains these specific disease prevention measures. And I'm wondering if you know what laws authorize these measures in your jurisdiction. Are you familiar with these laws? Do you know the details of these laws? Who's allowed to order them? How are they funded? How are they implemented? What means are there to increase compliance? Who's responsible for enforcement, and do they know it? Are there penalties for non-compliance? These are the expanded versions of what was originally in the tool, and we've added a few different additional control measures. The first category includes the restriction of movement of individuals, such as isolation of individuals who are sick or quarantine of individuals who are exposed. This is something most of our jurisdictions are familiar with, related to mostly tuberculosis, something that happens more commonly. This could also include, though, a quarantine of a group of people who can be specifically defined. So a specific group of people, like all of the passengers on a certain flight, so an identifiable group of people. But as we know from COVID, we might also need to restrict the movement of large groups of people. So the second category, we've broken it apart from the original tool. And so the second category is for the restriction and movement of all people within a community rather than identified individuals. So this includes things like restricting travel into a state or implementing a stay-at-home order. It also includes measures like cordon sanitaire, which is the quarantine of geographic areas. The category for schools includes excluding individual students that we had focused on in the past rounds, but such as those who are not vaccinated against a disease threat if the vaccination is available. It also includes closure or shutdown of schools. But as we saw during COVID, altered practices of schools may really be more common in the future. So this could include going to virtual or hybrid schooling, or alternating days of attendance, or running double bus routes to reduce the number of students in each seat. Closure of public places includes the businesses open to the public, like restaurants or stores, and mass gatherings could be large sporting events, parades, concerts, or even things like weddings or funerals. The altered practices may include things like reducing the total capacity of these by 50% or 25%, or capping the total attendance at a certain number. It might also include things like only allowing outdoor dining, or requiring building alterations to HVAC equipment, or having windows open, etc. And we've added mandates for personal protective equipment like masks, or screenings like temperature checks or negative tests. We've also included vaccine mandates and distribution of mass prophylaxis. Okay, can we go to the next one? So I've clipped out basically an excerpt from the schools section so that you can kind of get a taste of what types of questions are in each of the different categories. And they are fairly similar across categories, with specialty questions that are specific to each category also included. So here's an excerpt from the one on exclusion of schools or closure altered practices. And each section opens with similar instructions for each of the three parts. Part A is called legal authority. For the following questions, you respond first in the absence of or prior to a declaration of emergency, and then repeat, as I mentioned, with a declared emergency. Legal powers and authorities and procedures to close schools, exclude students, or otherwise alter practices or operations of schools. If it becomes necessary for officials to close schools, exclude students, or otherwise alter practices or operations of schools, including public, private, K-12, preschool, childcare, colleges, and universities, what legal authorities and procedures would enable, support, authorize, or otherwise provide a legal basis for doing so? And then it gives you the opportunity as a jurisdiction to walk through questions that address all of the legal powers, authorities, and procedures that are necessary for doing either a school closure or altered practices. And so you can see the different types of questions that are on here and included in this first section. Okay, can we flip to the next one? Great. So then we go on to section B, and this looks at interjurisdictional cooperation. Oh, I'm sorry, this looks at whether or not there's gaps in the authorities, first of all, sorry about that. And the gaps or insufficiencies are the areas that jurisdictions may want to address before moving on to a future emergency. So hopefully we would address these gaps in advance. Then, as I started to say about the next section looks at the interjurisdictional cooperation and overlapping authorities, such as when the state and locality each are potentially able to act on the same issue. Maybe this is a local jurisdiction who could close schools, and maybe the state could also close schools, or maybe the state can demand they stay open even if the local jurisdiction wants to close. It also looks at interjurisdictional cooperation. For example, where I live, there's a city school district for the largest city in the county, and the county school district for the smaller cities and unincorporated areas. they tried to collaborate, at least at the outset of COVID, to make decisions that were close or even the same in terms of closure and mask mandates, et cetera, in order for the messaging to be consistent and to avoid confusion, because they were just so closely connected and people might not be fully aware that they're attending a city school versus a county school. So this section is looking at neighboring jurisdictions and whether there might be agreements for the same type of communication or for making the same decisions as much as possible, or also for providing mutual aid if that might be important. Okay, so next. Okay, and part D gets into the decision making once authority is established. Public health laws establish that legal authority to act, but rarely provide the clear course of action about whether or when or how. And that's kind of one of the lessons that we really learned from that original social distancing law project, is we figured out what laws we have on the books, but not what would happen, after when we needed to actually use those laws. So most decisions, though, are discretionary. They rely on professional judgment, subject matter expertise, and the best currently available information. Decision makers have to balance competing interests to avoid acting prematurely without sufficient information or exposing the public to potential harm, while obtaining and evaluating evidence that supports a particular course of action. So this section of the template includes questions to help guide the discretionary decision making, and that's derived from another network tool on decision making that's available on the website called Can I, Must I, Should I? So if you haven't looked at that decision making tool, I definitely recommend that. The lead agency attorney should be at the table with other senior leadership when discussing information important to making discretionary decisions, as there can be legal and ethical implications. Attorneys are not only needed to explain the legal authority on the front end or to back cleanup if there's litigation on the back end, but instead attorneys should be involved as much as possible with public health leadership along the way as part of the team. There may also be legal alternatives with less risk that attorneys may be aware of to help public health achieve its goals. If the measure is discretionary, the jurisdiction also needs to consider legal and other consequences of inaction or action, ethical implications, whether there's disparate impact on certain populations, the best interest of community partners, finances, politics, so many other factors. The jurisdiction also needs to examine potential challenges in compliance and enforcement, as we've been discussing, and how to communicate these decisions to the public. These factors all must figure into decision-making by public health officials with the guidance of their attorneys. Okay, next slide. Thanks. Okay, so once the assessment's completed, it's time to organize that legal consultation meeting. This is an opportunity to bring together public health officials and attorneys, along with representatives from other relevant agencies or jurisdictions that may also have authority, such as private sector businesses or community organizations. With all of these people in the room, the time is ripe to have a training on the information that's been compiled in the legal assessment. This helps to level set and be sure that everyone has the same information about what the legal authorities actually are, not just what people think they are. And this is also an opportunity to ask questions and gain clarity, and also to raise any concerns. Then the tabletop exercise provides a hypothetical scenario to test the sufficiency of these laws against the scenario, to consider what factors would be important in whether to act or not and how to act, and to determine what might be needed for compliance and enforcement. This is also an opportunity to incorporate lessons learned from COVID after action reports or other assessments that may already be going on in your jurisdiction. And the reality is that there are likely gaps that need to be addressed. Testing against this hypothetical scenario offers a chance to identify any issues or concerns that arise and make plans to address them. It helps to identify what steps are needed next. Okay, next. So I'm not going to read all these to you, but this is just a list of some of the attendees who may have a role to play in a disease outbreak, and thus would be good for inviting to this legal tabletop exercise. And there may be others in your jurisdiction who should be invited and included. And kind of keep in mind, if there's somebody that you're thinking of, we'll ask this again and have you answer in the chat in a few minutes. Okay, can we move to the next question? Okay, so this is an excerpt from the tabletop exercise around the section that addresses school exclusion, since that's what we were talking about a minute ago. and other measures as well, but these can be tailored to a specific disease. So we've given you basically a chart with various different diseases and the characteristics of those diseases, and you would insert them in choosing one disease, you would insert that information into the tabletop exercise. You'd also be filling in information that's specific to your jurisdiction, such as the names or roles of people in your jurisdiction. Maybe they're not called the same thing, or maybe there's different people who would be implementing. Then you'd be filling this in specific to your jurisdiction. Also, if there's a specific event coming up that's important in your jurisdiction that you need to be considering, if the Super Bowl is going to be in your jurisdiction, then you may want to include that as part of the tabletop exercise, and there are spaces for you to fill that in and customize this to the needs of your department. Okay, let's go on one more to the next slide. Great, and this is a screenshot of the after action steps planning worksheet. So once you have gone through the tabletop exercise, you may have identified some gaps or inconsistencies that need to be addressed. And this is just a place to put that shorthand into a worksheet, and you'll have then an organized record of what is intended for after the meeting, and it gives you can put in deadlines so that you can regroup after a certain amount of time and see what's been done. It also allows you to jot down if there's going to be potential challenges or pushback, or if there's somebody that you need to be talking to specific to this particular action step, and a place to record results once those changes are made. Okay, next slide. So what are our next steps? We're looking for 3 pilot sites for jurisdictions interested in utilizing the tool. The pilot sites will be receiving technical assistance for completing the template and preparing the tabletop from both Denise and I. The pilot can be a scaled down version if a jurisdiction wants to focus on a particular disease prevention measure or measures rather than doing all of them at once. And after the pilots, we'll be incorporating the jurisdiction's feedback, the feedback from these webinars, and the feedback we're gaining from other experts who are providing comments to us. We're anticipating that these documents will go to clearance at CDC towards the end of the summer. And once through clearance, we'll be able to launch the official final version of the tool and post drafts for post finals for jurisdictions to use in the future. Also, if you would like for your colleagues to learn more about the tool, I'll be presenting it again, same type of presentation at the Preparedness Summit in Atlanta on April 24th. And this will be the same presentation. So if you want some of your colleagues to attend and hear more about this tool to see about getting them on board, please don't hesitate to give this information to them and tell them to join us on April 24th at the Preparedness Summit here in Atlanta. Okay, now we're going to be asking you some additional polling questions and then some chat questions, just to get a sense of how the tool might be used in your jurisdiction if you all were to move forward. So Daniel, can you post our next polling question? So is your jurisdiction doing an after action debrief on COVID-19? Have you already started this process? Are you underway doing an after action about the response? Okay, let's take a look. Great, great. Okay, let's look at the next question. Daniel. So if your jurisdiction is doing a COVID-19 after action debrief, that's those of you who said yes, does it include assessing legal authorities for disease control and response? Okay, let's take a look. Okay, yeah, so more than half of you, this isn't included in your after action. Okay, let's look at the next question. So if your jurisdiction is doing an after action debrief, is the attorney responsible for public health in your jurisdiction involved in this after action debrief? Okay, let's see. Okay, so about the same. Yeah, so many of you are underway in these after action debriefs, but it doesn't seem like law is covered in many of the places that are doing their debriefs, and the attorney is not involved. And we know that attorneys for different jurisdictions, of course, are involved at different rates. For instance, the state may have somebody on board for the public health department, but at the local level, it may be that you have an attorney, it may be that in-house, or it may be that you have a county or a city attorney who is responsible for not just public health, but many other departments, or it may be that you have someone on retainer and that calling them starts that clock ticking. So there's, a variety of involvement of the attorney with your jurisdiction. So definitely it's helpful to have your attorney involved as much as possible, but we also recognize there's some resource allocation there that's important to be assessing as well. Okay, great. Let's go ahead to the next question. So has your jurisdiction participated in a training or tabletop exercise on public health emergency legal authority? So this could be at any point in time. Have you done a training or a tabletop on public health emergency legal authority? Okay, let's see. Okay, just a few. So this prevention measures law project might be a great opportunity to do both the training and a tabletop testing out the legal authorities. This might be a good way to walk you through this process. Great. Okay, now we're going to move on to some chat questions. So you're going to be putting your answers into the chat for these next questions. So Daniel, can you flip to the next slide? Oops, lost my lights. All right. Okay, so in the chat, which of these disease prevention measures did your jurisdiction implement during the COVID-19 response? I'll give you a second to type. All seems to be a very common answer. Okay, not vaccine mandates in one state, or in one jurisdiction. Almost all, yeah. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, let's flip to the next question. Okay, so going along with that, what challenges did your jurisdiction face when implementing these measures? And how could this tool help your jurisdiction to address challenges with implementing disease control measures before the next disease outbreak? And we'll give a couple minutes to respond. If you have a few different challenges, maybe focus just on one. Denise, if you want to comment on any of these, feel free to jump in too. I saw one of the challenges scrolling by was from a tribe and was about connecting, collaborating with other jurisdictions surrounding the tribe. That's definitely important challenge that we hope that we're addressing through some of the questions in this tool. Ooh, islands pose a logistical challenge. Yeah, and you're right, reaching to vulnerable populations.
Certainly the note about state mandates, but law enforcement won't enforce. We've heard that frequently. And all of the problems with communications and disinformation. And of course, politics.
Legislative efforts to curtail the legal authorities. That's definitely important. And one thing that I'll say is that we have added into our tabletop exercise, kind of towards the end of the tabletop, what happens when the legislature changes direction and says that this no longer can move forward, or what happens when this, when there's litigation and the court throws something out. Is there a backup plan? What steps are next and how do you respond? So that is included. We did anticipate that in this tabletop exercise. Also, I will mention that the network and others with Act for Public Health Law are tracking these legislative efforts and also the litigation. And if that's something that you're interested in following, you might want to take a look at their site as well.
I'll note the note about Michigan, which is state level versus local level. State level, you get consistency, but it doesn't address the local concerns. Local level, you have variation among jurisdictions. So in some ways that can undermine your credibility, but all the challenges of what's the proper level of response, and then what happens when that switches, that changes.
Yeah, that's so true for preemption in general. There's pros and cons, and sort of navigating and knowing when to have the flexibility versus when to have the consistency is definitely a tension. Okay, great. These are really, really great responses, and I'm hoping we're collecting the chat, and we're hoping to check the boxes to make sure that we've captured a lot of these different challenges that you all have faced in the new version of our tool. All right, let's go to the next question. Okay, so this was the list that I told you we would come back to earlier of the people that we recommend considering to invite to your legal consultation meeting and tabletop exercise in your jurisdiction. So take a quick look again. Is there anybody who you think would be critical to include in your meeting and that may, not have understood your legal authority, or may not have known what their legal authority or responsibilities were, or perhaps there's others that we haven't considered on this slide that you might think should be included? Let's go ahead and put that in the chat too. I'm already seeing law enforcement several times. I think that that's definitely a lesson that we learned through COVID that, we hadn't really anticipated as much during earlier preparedness efforts and preparedness and planning, that we assumed law enforcement would be on board. But really, they also were dealing with capacity issues, as was healthcare, dealing with having their own members sick or their family members of their employees sick, and trying to be spread thin, handling things that they don't handle on a regular daily basis. Yeah, somebody's mentioning about how broad we're considering counsel for public health, and that there's other agencies like licensing and regulation. Yeah, I think that's really great. And CMS, Medicare and Medicaid services in the state would also be a really good organization to have present, a department to have present. So yeah. school officials for sure. And in some places, schools have the authority to shut down, based on the school officials. And then in some places, public health also has that authority. Sometimes public health doesn't, but needs to be present before school officials will want to shut down for a public health reason because they want the backup that it's necessary. So having that connection, that relationship is definitely really critical. Denise, do you see others that are?
Yeah, I think you've hit, there's some more messages. Let me get to the new ones.
I see business, Chamber of Commerce. I think involving business is also really important. As we saw really with mask mandates and with the initial distancing, keeping 6 feet, that kind of thing, we asked our businesses to be enforcers. We said, check at the door if someone's wearing a mask, and we really relied on our businesses to carry out some of those functions for enforcement and compliance, and having businesses already on board to understand the importance to be supportive and to be supportive of them, then I think that's a really great way to involve them at the front end. Great. Okay, let's move to the next slide. We only have a few more minutes, and I want to also offer an opportunity for questions. So what challenges might your jurisdiction face with implementing this tool? And what would help you to address these challenges? Getting everyone in the same room is always a challenge. The timing, figuring out when everyone can be somewhere, that's absolutely helpful to see. That's great too. Denise?
Probably with time goes capacity.
Funding. I mean, the tool itself doesn't necessarily cost anything, but we know your time is precious, so for sure. Getting buy-in, getting interest, yeah, staff capacity. Okay, while those are coming in, I'm going to mention a couple of things that are here in the Q&A. Somebody wants to know if we're going to answer the questions in the Q&A. Yes, that's where that's what's next. Okay, great. Let's see. So is there an updated tool published? Not yet. So the older tool is available on the CDC's website on the public health law program page. I think it's cdc.gov/PHLP. The new and updated tool will be posted after we incorporate the feedback of the pilots and the other experts that we have reviewing the tool. Once that's incorporated, it has to go through CDC clearance. So we're hoping that once the clearance is finalized, we'll be able to get the final tool published and posted. So that'll be hopefully not too long. I'm guessing late summer, early fall. Sorry. Okay, somebody else is asking about closure of businesses and funding, and I think this is handled differently in different places, so I don't want to overspeak, but these are questions that I think are addressed by the tool, and so that's why involving commerce, involving businesses in that discussion on the front end is really important. And I
can speak to this one a little.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Generally, public public health has broad and flexible powers. And when it's talking about interventions that protect the public as a whole, unless there's a specific law, and I'm talking about state level, often those aren't things where, because you've taken an action to close a business or restrict other activities, that it's a taking. But there are a lot of important issues, and we've tried to develop the tool in a way to recognize public health discretion and that professional judgment is needed, and that there are trade-offs and how you do those trade-offs. So we hope the tool and all of our experience from the last few years are going to be relevant to looking at where the burdens and the benefits lie, and how do you help distribute those so that particular groups, all who contribute to the protection of others, aren't unfairly, penalized while others are not. So it's really difficult, and we hope the tool will help you look at these stickier issues.
Yeah.
Questions submitted during registration, are they going to be addressed here? Do you have them, Daniel? I don't know how that's handled.
They're not being answered. It's questions raised during the webinar will be answered right now.
Okay, great.
Okay,
then-
and there is a question about, this is coming from someone who is, I believe, an acupuncturist, about traditional medicines, but I can't speak to that specific element, but there is part of that question says, what efforts are being made to address structural racism? And I do want to say that we have made efforts in this tool to focus on health equity and to look at how various different measures might be burdening some communities more than others. And hopefully have an opportunity to really discuss that and to think about it in advance, so that we are not continuing to burden or adding to the burden or exacerbating existing problems caused by structural racism. Denise, do you have anything to add to that about our health equity piece?
No, I don't have anything to add. Very important to address.
Great. Let's see if there's anything else. It looks like we have about 2 more minutes for questions. The recording, I see that a couple of people have asked about the recording. The recording will be made available, Daniel, right on the network page?
Yes, it should be up in about a week, and then we can send chat transcriptions as necessary.
Okay, great. Okay, all right. Well, I think that we are out of time. I want to say thank you to everyone who has participated, to all the attendees for all these great comments, great feedback. Sorry, we talked a little bit of health equity outside of that question. But if you have any answers in these last couple seconds about how we could use the tool even more to consider health equity, I would appreciate any responses that you have to that before you sign off. But thank you so much for attending. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Denise or I. On the last slide, there is, there is our email addresses. So definitely reach out if you are wanting to talk with us more about this. And then Daniel, do you want to flip to that last slide and say something about the conference?
Yeah, thank you everyone for your participation in today's webinar, and thank you to our panelists for such an amazing presentation. So just a final few notes to the attendees. As I mentioned before, a copy of the webinar slides and a video recording of the webinar should be available within the next week. The video will be on YouTube, and then email will be sent directly to you with the slides. However, I also just want to take a moment to extend an invitation to the Network for Public Health Law's National Conference this October, which will be here where I am in Minneapolis. And It's about people, policy, and progress, and we'd love to have you all there if you really enjoyed your time today. But that concludes our webinar. Thank you all for attending and have a great day.